I'm speaking for the Consistent Democrats. My name's Ian. The Consistent Democrats are the British section of the LCFI. We see the war in Ukraine as a crucial conflict in this period between imperialism and its opponents and victims. It's a product of the decay of imperialism, and in particular the world imperialist hegemon, the United States, whose decline of an imperialist power is well underway, in a manner somewhat analogous to the situation British imperialism began to suffer after World War I. Because if you look back, after the German challenge was defeated in 1918, Britain was eclipsed, not by an enemy, but by what became its most important ally, the United States. And the US is actually originally a creation of mainly British colonists, but it negated and pushed out its originator and became British imperialism's successor as the world hegemon. And this became possible because of the economic decline of British imperialism as an economic and military power. Its internal contradictions in terms of the beginning of its economic decline, and not least it's the developing revolt of many of its colonial subjects against their own subordination. These liberation struggles expanded massively after World War I, and the decline of Britain proceeded apace in the interwar period. And the liberation struggles were massively accelerated by the Russian Revolution in 1917 and the enormous ideological and often material help and inspiration that the initially revolutionary Soviet Republic under the early Bolshevik dictatorship gave to anti-colonial struggles everywhere. Since the British Empire at that point was by far the biggest, it was most shaken and damaged by the Russian Revolution and its galvanizing effect internationally. In parallel with that, we had the Great Depression and the 1929, the tragic course that the class struggle took because of that, with Hitler's rise in Germany, and the viability of British imperialism its hegemony was further massively eroded. Germany under Hitler's rule, jointly with Japan, and to a lesser extent Italy, attempted to take advantage of the decline of Britain and to head off the evident project of the United States to replace Britain as the world hegemon. And in a sense, the United States was helped to victory and the conquest of world hegemony over its imperialist rivals by the successful resistance of the first worker state, albeit degenerated, the USSR, to Hitler. Both the imperialist allies of the United States in World War II, Britain and France, and its imperialist enemies, Germany, Japan, and Italy, became its clients in a military sense. Despite considerable economic tensions and episodic disagreements, sorry, what's happening? Despite considerable economic tensions and episodic disagreements over the last 3/4 of a century since World War II, that pecking order has remained essentially intact. But it's being threatened decisively now by the economic and military decline of the United States as the world hegemon, whose fundamental problem is the most basic problem in the capitalist system itself, the long-term tendency of profit rates to decline. And that's what's driven the United States to a course of action that's put US hegemony in danger. Deindustrialization has become a categorical imperative in all the older capitalist countries and has particularly affected the United States and Britain. The large-scale export of manufacturing jobs to East Asia, particularly China, has created a new situation in the world. It dovetails splendidly with the project of counter-revolution from above of the Chinese Stalinists that grew out of Deng Xiaoping's market reforms to the Chinese deformed worker state at the end of the 1970s. And this accumulated through the 1980s as part of China's bloc with US imperialism against the USSR. So the Chinese Stalinist bureaucracy helped imperialism destroy the USSR, and it was the military pressure of imperialism that forced it to devote a disproportionate part of its resources to the military. And this brought about the economic stagnation in the USSR that led a decisive section of the bureaucracy to capitulate to imperialism through the program of perestroika, both in the economic sense, with an accelerating drive to embrace the market in a manner that always logically pointed to capitalist restoration, and in the military sense, in a strategic sense, as escaping from that military pressure, it logically pointed to capitulation. And that's what basically happened. And as a result, Russia underwent capitalist restoration and an incredibly ruinous economic shock treatment at the beginning of the 1990s, after the August 1991 failed coup attempt. And Gorbachev's perestroika, initially sweetened by glasnost, the false promise of political freedom to the working class, it led to millions of deaths. The economic decline under Yeltsin, who expressed Gorbachev's program more consistently, the economic decline was steeper and more deadly than that happened in Germany after 1929. And in Russia, the experience of millions of deaths and impoverishment at the hands of imperialism and neoliberalism led to a massive popular backlash against neoliberalism. And it led to the growth of nostalgia for much better times under the Soviet workers' state, even under Stalinist rule. So the thing is that imperialist capitalism was torn out by the roots in Russia in 1917, and that's a material fact of enormous significance for Marxists. There can be no comparison of Russia with Germany for that reason. So the popular backlash in Russia was a backlash against neoliberalism. The defeated official communist movement was in no position to lead opposition to capitalism and neoliberalism. So what happened instead is that part of the Russian bourgeoisie, which had inherited the military power of the USSR, saw the opportunity to develop in a different direction, using that military power and its economic weight as an energy supplier, particularly, in the first instance. The result being a peculiar form of non-imperialist capitalism, which has negligible power in terms of the financial plundering nature of imperialism, but considerable military power and power as an energy supplier, comparable in some ways to Saudi Arabia or Iraq or Venezuela in that sense. And it had a unique ability to resist imperialist domination. At the same time, the imperialist export of large numbers of jobs and industry, driven by the quest to raise declining profit rates, led to China's growth as an industrial power. And it benefited from what John Smith, the author of a work called Imperialism in the 21st Century, called global labor arbitrage, which basically was about the export of manufacturing jobs to low-wage economies. And China benefited enormously from that in a funny sort of, in a paradoxical way, because this happened concurrently with the counter-revolution from above in China that proceeded apace in the 1990s and took a very, very different form from in Russia. And China's form of capitalist restoration actually avoided neoliberal shock treatments afflicted Russia, and China managed to industrialize itself and become a major industrial power that benefited in a paradoxical way from its status as a reservoir of cheap but skilled. It benefited out of the imperialist neoliberal drive to outsource industrial labor. And it paradoxically allowed the Chinese bureaucracy to restore capitalism from above with a kind of bourgeois mixed economy that's very, very much marked by China's decades as a deformed worker state. And that also allowed China to paradoxically resist imperialist domination. And this is bizarre. When they realized what had happened, this produced anti-Chinese sentiment in the United States, expressed in Trumpism, when the penny dropped as to what the US bourgeoisie had managed to do. And they created a non-imperialist capitalist industrial rival whose driving force is not finance capital, i.e. the extraction of revenue in a parasitic sense from dependent countries. These two major non-imperialist countries have been driven together for self-defense against US imperialism, which is very, very fearful of its own future, of its world hegemony. And US imperialism, as we know, it cannot tolerate any country in the world that seriously endeavors to defy it and assert real sovereignty. And that's what this conflict is about. It's about the decline of US imperialism and threats to its world hegemony. But this is very, very unlike the situation in the 1920s, in the 1930s and 40s, when British imperialism's hegemony was first threatened and then eclipsed by US imperialism. Because this time, US imperialism is not threatened with being eclipsed by another imperialist hegemon. It's not how imperialism works. Imperialism is an exclusive club. It's not possible for oppressed countries to join it. That would contradict Lenin's understanding of imperialism. And it also contradicts experience. I mean, only one relatively minor imperialist power has emerged in virgin territory since the First World War, when the advanced capitalist countries tore themselves apart and gave birth to the October Revolution. And that was Israel. And that was transplanted in an artificial manner, the social and political expression of a distinct layer within the existing imperialist bourgeoisies that for their own unique reasons sought their own national state. But Russia and China don't fit that model at all. They're both products of the decay of the world revolution and of the failure of imperialism to replenish itself, proof of the nature of imperialist capitalism as a system in decay and decline. They're anomalous hybrid forms of capitalism, whose capitalism, instead of replicating imperialism, is very much marked by its origins in states that for decades were degenerated forms of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And neither imperialism nor they are historically viable. Imperialism is reactionary through and through. But these states are at odds with it. They're at odds with it, but they are anomalous byproducts of a temporary decline and setback of the world revolution. That's how we see it. But the road to revolution is still through the defeat of imperialism. And the non-imperialist nature of these states and the fact that they're now forced to resist imperialism imposes a duty on the world working class to defend them against imperialism. This resistance to imperialism inspires an element of anti-imperialist consciousness in the working class who come to understand it, which is actually the road to revolutionary class consciousness. And a conscious understanding of how this paradox came to be, how these anomalous states in conflict with imperialism are products of revolutions that regressed or were born with deformations that hamstrung them from the start, point to the solution in class consciousness. A defeat for imperialism at the hand of these non-imperialist states points the road back to the revolution and the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat as the solution to the huge social, environmental and cultural barbarism that imperialism is dragging us into. A successful defense of Russia and China and the defeat of imperialist hegemony points back to the need for the world revolution as the only thing that can save humanity from destruction at the hands of imperialist capitalism. Thank you, comrades.